Take a network break. I'm Drew Conry Murray.
And I'm Jonna Johnson.
Help yourself to a virtual donut with a side of ranch dressing for a certain network engineer in Iceland. And join us as we tiptoe through the tulips of networking and IT news. Jonna, what do we have today?
Well, we've got Palo Alto Networks and VMware announcing critical patches and a few other vulnerabilities, a Nokia Microsoft deal for switches, some new products from NetBox, intelligent autonomous RAN, what a wonderful acronym that makes, and some comments on the suspicious undersea cable cuts, voice cloning in Microsoft Teams, and more.
And after the news, stay tuned for a sponsored Tech Bytes conversation about Ethernet switches and wireless APs with sponsor Fortinet. Yes, Fortinet, best known for firewalls and other security products. Fortinet has a full line of switches for the campus and data center, as well as wireless APs. And we talk with Fortinet about the case it makes for you converging your network and security with its switch and AP portfolio. And just a reminder, Network Break is not the only show in the Packet Pushers podcast arsenal. There's Network Automation Nerds with author Eric Cho for all things network automation, Total Network Operations with Scott Raban. He's sharing best practices and tool stacks for network operations, and Technically Leadership with Laura Santamaria to help technical folks get better at being effective and humane managers. And John, let's start with a quick FU.
Yes, we got a write-in from someone who explicitly said he's not looking for it to go on air, so we're not going to be reading it. But essentially his concern was, hey guys, it's great that you're calling out CVEs, particularly the, really critical ones, 9 and above, but could you please be consistent on that? If you're going to call out, lower scoring CVEs from vendors X, Y, and Z, please don't skip higher scores from vendors P, D, and Q. And we took a look at that and said, you're right. And we agree. We are going to be a little more consistent going forward on reporting CVEs, so you listeners can be confident you'll hear everything that matters to network engineers and to your colleagues. Now, on to some Palo Alto exploits, speaking of CVEs.
Yeah, so two Palo Alto Networks vulnerabilities rated highest urgency by the vendor are being actively exploited in the wild. CVE 2024-0012 is an authentication bypass vulnerability affecting several versions of Palo Alto Networks PAN-OS software. The vulnerability lets an unauthenticated attacker with network access to the management web interface get admin privileges on the device. The next CVE 2024-9474, this is a privilege escalation vulnerability in PAN-OS software that lets a PAN-OS admin with access to the management web interface get root privileges on the firewall. So essentially, this is a 1-2 punch remote authentication bypass and then privilege escalation in the management console. Bad deal all around. Software upgrades are available as well as workarounds. If you haven't jumped on this yet, it should be a priority.
Yep, they're saying over 2,000 instances compromised globally, so do pay attention on that one. And in the cybersecurity vein, there's an AI company that told the SEC it lost $250,000 in what it's calling a cyber attack. The company is iLearning Engines. They filed an 8K form with US SEC on notifying the agency of a recent cybersecurity incident. According to the company, quote, a threat actor illegally accessed the company's environment and certain files on its network, misdirected a $250,000 wire payment, and deleted a number of email messages. So if you're listening to this, you're probably going, well, that's not really a cyber attack. I mean, it is, but it isn't. It is, however, definitely a thing, and cybersecurity professionals should be aware that it's increasing in frequency and severity. This is not, in other words, your father's Nigerian prince exploit. The FBI has said that in 2023, business email compromise accounted for almost $3 billion worth of losses. They warned that scammers are increasingly using custodial accounts held at financial institutions for cryptocurrency exchanges or third-party payment processors. They said even in August, about $60 million was stolen from one of the leading suppliers of carbon products after an employee was tricked into making several wire transfers, and a school district in Tennessee was also tricked into handing over millions. In other words, you need to start thinking about beefing up both your logging and your protection of fund transfers. One recommendation is to set up an autonomous log that will note all emails created and deleted. So even if they are deleted, there's at least a record they existed that is not in the email system you're using. One of the things that we found is that mismatches between log results generally point to cybersecurity hacks. We have scenarios where that has been the only clue that something's happened. And last but not least, you really need to be building an additional protection for custodial accounts, maybe MFA if you need to, and quite possibly multi-party sign-off. So it's not possible to make a wire transfer without getting it signed off on by a third party and documented. So the CFO has to sign off, but somebody else does as well. Any thoughts on
Yeah,
that, Drew?
no, those are all sensible things, particularly that logging to look for those mismatches. That makes a lot of sense. And it's also, I feel like we go through these cycles where sort of email is a problem, and then we feel like we've got a handle on it, and then it becomes another a renewed threat vector, or maybe it's just an ongoing threat vector, and it seems like that's the issue here.
Yep, and it's not just the email. I would highlight the fact that humans are taking actions based on the email, and those actions need to be looked at more closely as well.
It also sounds like good old-fashioned social engineering still plays
Yep.
a role here with people being tricked into doing things they shouldn't, and which may tie into a later story about Microsoft voice
I
cloning,
was
but
just going to say that deep fakes are here, guys.
that's
Okay,
right.
but moving right along.
Moving on back to vulnerabilities, VMware is taking another crack at patching vulnerabilities in vCenter server that could allow privilege escalation and remote code execution. The vulnerabilities affect vSphere and Cloud Foundation users. VMware issued patches for this back in September 24, then released new patches in mid-November because the first attempt didn't fix the issues. These are tied to CVEs 38812 and 38813. VMware says the vulnerabilities qualify as an emergency change and exploits are being tracked in the wild. VMware writes, a malicious actor with network access to vCenter may trigger this vulnerability by sending a specially crafted network packet, potentially leading to remote code execution. So VMware thought it had the fire put out. It did not. It is trying again. And that means maybe you have to try again as well if you already patched this the first time around.
Well put, Drew. Well put. And speaking of vulnerabilities, there are a couple in D-Link and H3C devices. There have been a couple CVEs over 8 in the past couple weeks, including 2 at 9.8. CVE 2024-52759 notes that D-Link devices contain your classic buffer overflow via the
Hey,
IP parameter in the IP position ASP function. So that's a severity 9.8. Also, H3C cluster routers are vulnerable to remote code execution via the ASP form parameter. So as we noted above, we'll be paying closer attention to which ones come out, maybe the ones that don't necessarily get all the publicity, but you should still be aware of if you're using either D-Link or H3C devices.
yeah, and we can crowdsource this a little bit too. If you feel like there's something we missed or you get a wind of something that you think we might want to cover, you can always hit us up at packetpushers.net/FU or packetpushers.net/follow-up if you don't like the FU part, but that's what the FU is for. Yeah, so let's jump into some non-cybersecurity related news. NetBox Labs has announced 2 new products that will complement its popular NetBox Source of Truth software. The products are called Discovery and Assurance, and I'll take them piece by piece. Discovery is a separate software product that lets you discover devices on your network, just like it says. It's built off NetBox Labs diode software. It ingests and formats data into the NetBox data model, and Discovery now incorporates an agent-based discovery function. I think this is interesting because NetBox Labs, when it first came out, it was sort of like, yeah, we're a partner with everybody. We're friends. There's lots of other people doing discovery, and we'll just team up with them. Now they are moving laterally into that discovery market at the risk potentially of alienating partners. I do think this kind of move is inevitable, especially in a market that's beginning to take off like Source of Truth and network automation. It is a tried and true vendor technique. Jonna, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I'm just sort of curious. When are these products coming out? Do you happen to remember?
Discovery is coming out Q4 2024, so anytime.
Mm-hmm.
And Assurance, that's a separate software offering again. It's going to integrate with NetBox. Assurance is designed to help companies deal with operational drift. That is the difference between what your intended state is documented in NetBox and the actual state of network devices. The NetBox blog says Assurance has 2 design goals. First, to characterize operational drift so teams can analyze, build plans, and get drift under control. And second, to keep it that way with power tools for identifying and remediating deviations quickly. Assurance is coming out in 2025.
Yeah, and I think the first part of that goal is actually the most interesting. It's sort of why are you drifting away from your actual design? What's leading to that? What's causing it? And what can you do about it? So I think these are both very interesting announcements for the same reason you said, and keep an eye out for them.
Yeah, I think it's also a sign of NetBox's ambition. It sort of started off as this sort of upstart open source project. It's now got commercial versions, and as with all products that start to come with licensing, you get rooted into an org with a product, and then you start picking off other functions as you get more tightly coupled to that customer, and you're developing new revenue sources. So I think it's a sign that NetBox is ambitious and sees more money to be made out there and more services to deliver. So we'll keep an eye on that. Moving on, Nokia is extending a multi-year deal with Microsoft to provide data center routers and switches to Azure. The new deal extends the relationship to 5 years. Reading between the lines of the press release, I assume the bulk of the relationship is around the Nokia routers, but Nokia also called out that it's going to provide, quote, management top-of-rack switches that is used extensively throughout the Azure network. So I thought this was interesting for a couple of reasons. First is market awareness. Like you, the listener, might not be aware that Nokia actually sells data center switches. It does. So extending a deal with Microsoft helps get Nokia's name as a competitor in the switching market. John, the thoughts here?
Yeah, I think that's actually a key reason for this because that's pretty much going to be the reaction from quite a lot of folks. They do that, so yeah,
Right.
it's a great way to get to piggyback off one of the best brand recognition companies in the world.
Yeah, and one thing to note about this deal is that the Nokia switches itself are going to run Microsoft's Sonic NOS on the Nokia boxes, but Nokia also has SR Linux NOS that's suited for the enterprise. So if you're considering a data center refresh, you should check out Nokia. It's another vendor you can add to your competitive matrix. I also
You're
think it's interesting.
playing right into the Nokia strategy
I
there,
know I'm
Drew,
I'm
but
helping them here,
But
but
hey,
I
not a bad thing. We look at it as helping the folks that are trying to do this engineering and use the right tools and
yeah,
do the right
exactly.
selection. So
If you're looking at other vendors, you might as well add another one to your list.
exactly.
I also think it's interesting from a competitive perspective because Microsoft is a huge buyer of Arista switches, and so much so that Arista's quarterly financial results can tilt positive or negative depending on how many switches Azure buys in a month or a quarter. It's now got sort of a hungry upcoming competitor buried in a key customer, so I'm curious to see how that plays out. I also think it's a sign of Azure's huge appetite, frankly, for network infrastructure. So by extending the relationship with Nokia, it's got more of a diversified supply chain for Ethernet switches.
Yeah, and in fact, Microsoft's doing an awful lot of these kinds of strategic moves right now, which is quite interesting. Um, All right, so switching gears a little bit, now we've got SoftBank and Red Hat announcing AI-based radio access network or intelligent autonomous RAN, which of course, for those of us of a certain age, makes me think I ran so far away. That's flock of seagulls for those of you who didn't get it. But SoftBank, in collaboration with Red Hat, is advancing AI-based radio access network technologies to create intelligent autonomous networks optimized for 5G, 6G, and 7G and beyond applications. And the partnership is focused on integrating AI into RAN infrastructure using the ARM architecture, performance optimization, and developing an orchestrator to enable even faster data processing and enhanced automation. Together, they aim to develop an open, interoperable RAN ecosystem, unlocking new AI-driven use cases and improving network efficiency and user experience. Obviously, these are all hopes, plans, wishes, and dreams, but it is interesting to see how they're putting it together and what tools they're using to attempt to execute on those hopes, plans, and wishes and dreams.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I guess no market sector is safe from the AI sauce being
Hmm.
poured on it. So this definitely is something that if you're in that RAN business, you want to look at the details very carefully because there's a lot of AI promise and not necessarily always the AI delivery. So
Exactly, but I do find it interesting that they're building on the ARM architecture in general because that is a well thought out architecture. Doesn't mean it's necessarily going to be, taking the ultimate prize, but it's always good when people are building on something that makes sense as opposed to something that doesn't.
yeah, there is also a concerted effort to sort of break open the RAN market from sort of the incumbents and allow you to
Exactly.
build on sort of off-the-shelf software and hardware components. So this is probably with that Red Hat element in there, part of that continuing development. And John, a tip of the hat for the flock of seagulls reference. It's gonna be my head for the rest of the day, but I don't mind because love that band.
Me too.
Uh, we teased this earlier. Microsoft is rolling out a new feature in Microsoft 365 that simulates your voice during Teams meetings. The voice simulation capability is part of an interpreter agent that provides real-time speech-to-speech interpretation from one language to another. Supported languages include Mandarin, English, French, German, Italian, Japanese, Korean, Brazilian, Portuguese, and Spanish. I think the real-time interpretation is cool, like from one language to another, but that voice cloning part makes my spidey sense tingle, Jonna.
Yeah, well, and I'm also interested in the real-time interpretation because it turns out that there's a whole lot of nuance to doing real-time interpretation.
Hmm.
So, I, I know you're worried about the whole notion of better deepfakes, and I certainly
Yeah,
agree with
voice
that.
cloning scares me
Right.
a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, but I also am worried about the fact that you're able to go in and very subtly hack conversations. So, for example, there is a wonderful story about a true story about in right after 9/11 when there were lots of conversations between people speaking Arabic and other languages talking about terrorism, and the people that were involved in doing the translation were corrupted by gifts and things like that within the US intelligence services. So a lot of potentially concerning things that would have tipped off 9/11 never bubbled to the top because essentially the translators were hacked. And I look at
The
this and I
human
go,
translators.
the human translators were hacked by a large deposits in their bank accounts. Um, there's a great book about it called The Classified Woman. I urge you to look it up because even though it's a bit of a polemic, it's still quite eye-opening when you realize the process that this goes through. But that then makes me think, good heavens, that's just a whole new vector for attack above and beyond the worries, the obvious worries about deepfake voice cloning.
Yeah, so I have a question on, I love the, real-time interpretation feature. Yes, there can be issues there, but I feel like I'm a Trekkie. I want to get close to that universal translator function, and maybe this is getting us there somewhat. But why add the voice simulation to that? I don't know. According to
Well,
a story,
there's
go
just
ahead.
no other way to do it, Drew, right? Like
No, I mean you could,
you talk, I
but
have to then create the speech.
right, but you could just use sort of that traditional robotic voice as opposed to trying to make it sound like me.
Well, Google's already there with their Note AI or whatever it's called. Basically, if you feed it a piece of paper, it will create a document, not a piece of paper, obviously, electronic document. It will create a very lively and engaging podcast using two completely cloned voices. So they will not,
I
however, make references to a flock of seagulls and books that they've read and liked or ball games that they've gone to. So that's how you can tell we're actually human. So I guess my feeling is, yeah, we're already there with the synthetic voices. I'm just a bit more concerned about the real-time translation vulnerabilities at this point.
I'm also worried about potential mishaps because of just sort of the idioms in language, what might be mistranslated or go untranslated. But that's something that, probably can be worked out over time. And not just to be always a negative about new technology, I do think the plus side of this, if you can like put together an AI avatar and a chatbot and this voice clone, you might never have to go to another meeting again. So maybe there's an
Woohoo!
upside
There
to
you
that.
go. All of a sudden, Teams goes from my rock bottom least favorite to the top. I only want to do these meetings on Teams because I can
And we
vape
can just have chatbots talking to each other while we get on with life.
and listen to music. Okay. Moving right along, CoreWeave says it's going to offer a cloud service based on Nvidia 6-chip superchips. CoreWeave is announcing a new, wait for it, GPU as a service offering
Mhm.
based on Nvidia's new GB200 NVL4 superchip. The chip combines 4 Blackwell GPUs, 2 Grace CPUs, and a high-speed interconnect on a single board for high-performance computing and AI workloads, offering what it claims is significant speed improvements over previous models, featuring an optimized onboard communication via NVLink, while the offboard data uses Ethernet. So essentially, you will be using all of this as a GPU as a service. Note that Blackwell chips are sold out through the end of the next calendar year. That is, I believe, the end of 2025. And in fact, a side note on this, NVIDIA has pretty much told everybody, like, we are done. Thanks to supply chain limitations, demand is going to exceed supply for the foreseeable future, which caused me to put a not quite joking comment on LinkedIn, which is if you're planning to invest in the next sure thing, if you're worried about a coming financial crisis, forget about gold, forget about cryptocurrencies, and go for those NVIDIA chips. So those are going to be solid.
Yeah, and I think that's probably one of the reasons behind these, GPU as a service offerings. If you may not be able to get your hands on them, never mind having the in-house technical capability to build them out and then build the network needed to connect them all to run your AI modeling jobs. Presumably, this is what these are for. So it makes perfect sense for somebody to build a service. And there's multiple different competitors out there offering this GPU as a service. So expecting to see a lot of interest in this space.
Yeah, totally agree. And speaking of side adjacent wireless, such as we were talking about the IRAN before, Morse Micro and Vantron are teaming to boost IoT connectivity through Wi-Fi HaLow. If you're not familiar with HaLow, HaLow is a wireless standard designed for IoT connectivity, and Vantron and Morse Micro are partnering to advance it. They're hoping to create energy-efficient, long-range, low-powered products, including modules, access points, and an IP camera, leveraging Morse Micro's MM6108 chip they're targeting industrial and consumer applications. So
Hmm.
if you're following the HaLow Wi-Fi standard for IoT connectivity, this is a significant movement.
Yeah, and I just want to say this is also further indication of the growing intersection between IT and OT or IT and IoT, where your traditional IT responsibilities may be bleeding into that OT space that you hadn't been involved in before. So something you might want to, brush up on. Johnny, you and I both heard about the news of submarine cable breaks in the Baltic Sea. Questions about so the news is 2 undersea fiber optic cables that connected Finland to Germany and Sweden to Lithuania were damaged in pretty quick succession, which raised suspicions of sabotage. The case is still under investigation, but there is a lot of questions about, was this on purpose? Was this an accident? If so, who was it? And of course, everybody's thinking, well, if it was on purpose, it was Russia.
Well, and also could have been an accident and Russia as
Right.
well.
That's true.
As
It could
I
have been
read,
Russia and an accident. All these conditions can be true.
yes, exactly. Part of me immediately leaps up with never assume malevolence when there's the possibility of stupidity. But at the same time, it's a little hard to accidentally cut an undersea cable. So yeah, I'm suspecting that that's probably the case. But my question is, I'm not sure there's enough that would indicate that it really is to get wrapped around the axle. I guess the main
Yeah.
thing to pay attention to is that undersea cables are growing like crazy. And in fact, if your mental map of what is existing anywhere around Europe, the North Atlantic, the Pacific, is over 2 years old, you are wildly out of date. This is kind of similar to the satellites, where if you look up the number of satellites that are in the sky, even as recently as 5 years ago, it was about 2,000. Now we are at 22,000 in the sky. So when you're looking up there, you're probably seeing more satellites than stars if you're lucky enough to see a night sky these days. So coming back to this, I think what this really highlights is less Russian potential incompetence or evil, and more the fact that there is a huge mesh network out there of undersea cables and that they're becoming more and more critical.
Yeah, it also, I think, highlights the resiliency and robustness that telecom providers have built into these undersea cable networks, in that these cuts didn't actually have much of an effect on, internet and voice traffic, because they have redundancy built in. Aside from individual glass fibers within the sea cables, they often just will also be sending traffic over other cables, separate cables. So cutting one cable doesn't necessarily mean cutting you off entirely, and that's how it's meant to be. We do need redundancy, and it sounds like in some
We
ways
have
this
it.
was a good test for that redundancy, whether it was on purpose or not. I dropped the link in to the show notes from telegeography that is just sort of, they rolled it out after the all this news dropped, and said, most of the time it's an anchor, it's fishing equipment, it's not malicious, and it's hard to actually ascertain what happened, because whether you're a saboteur or a smuggler or fishing illegally, you're going to turn off your boat's transponder so nobody knows who it is, which complicates attribution. So yeah, John, I think at this point I'm leaning toward incompetence rather than malevolence.
Yeah, and I would also add that, frankly, if you want to cut something or cut something off, there are much juicier targets with much less redundancy. I'm not going to mention what they are on this podcast because presumably Putin knows about them, but you never know, so I'm not going to give them away. But I would say this ranks pretty low on the strategic target list.
John, I like that you're assuming Putin is listening. I don't know if we have that reach, but that's something to shoot for someday.
I'll quote you on that there, Drew.
All right, that wraps up the news portion of our show. Stick around for our sponsored conversation with Fortinet on their Ethernet switch and AP offerings. That's coming right up. Today on the Tech Bytes podcast, we talk Ethernet switches and wireless APs with sponsor Fortinet. Yes, Fortinet. Best known for firewalls and other security products, Fortinet has a full line of switches for the campus and data center, as well as a robust portfolio of wireless APs. And Fortinet is here to make the case as a switching and wireless player. We'll talk about how its products converge networking, security, and more. Our 40 guests are Chris Hins, Senior Director, Product and Solutions, Secure Connectivity, and James Allen, Director of Product Marketing and Solutions, LAN Access, and Zero Trust. Chris and James, welcome to the podcast. Let's jump right into it. Why is Fortinet in the switching and wireless business?
Fortinet has always had this vision of the importance of bringing networking and security together, really needing to converge these two things to ensure that you have the most secure network possible. As you highlighted earlier, being a security company, we take security of all forms very seriously. So we really wanted to ensure that we could build the most secure, easy, and intelligent network possible.
what does the convergence of security and networking mean to Fortinet, and how is that sort of manifested then?
So really what it represents is actually integrating our wired and wireless equipment directly into the core operating system that really drives what we call our security fabric, our platform. So when we look at our wired and wireless networking equipment, it's an extension, say, of FortiOS, which runs on every FortiGate next generation firewall we ship.
Mhm.
And what it does is it allows us to do some things that other vendors are unable to do, as far as things like visibility, things like being able to take segmentation and micro-segmentation all the way down to the switch port level and so on.
So this is not a third-party switch wireless access point ecosystem. This is Fortinet's own gear.
That is correct. And in fact, that also differentiates us from many, because it's not something, for example, with our switches, these are developed by us. They are our switches. They're not switches that we are, taking from another vendor. For us, we actually developed our switches first as an extension for the FortiGate next generation firewall. As you can imagine, you can't have a firewall with 48 ports. And so what we looked at is how do we actually enable those ports as if they're firewall ports. And so we started really with our Access series of switches. These are more entry-level switches, 1 gig, also multi-gig entry-level switches, and then began to broaden that out going into the campus core, and even to the data center with some of our higher speeds, 10, 25, 100 gig switches. We also actually have a ruggedized line as well, designed not only, typically you hear it associated with OT, but in fact, any environment where a standard switch, a carpeted safe switch, is just not going to be okay in that environment.
So there is a different switch lines then, it sounds like. We've got different products aimed at different parts of the network. If I wanted to put Fortinet switches in my data center, you'd have products for that versus the closet versus other places.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, they are broken up into what amounts to be an access level, which is kind of more of our entry level. But these also are applicable to, say, for example, branch, uh, campus, campus core, and data center are kind of synonymous for us. And those are the higher speeds that you kind of spoke of, that would be basically sitting top of rack or data center. And then the ruggedized OT has been an area we've been investing in heavily here over the last several years.
So the ruggedized for operational networks, that is stuff that's going to be in harsh environments, and so it's got the special casing and all that kind of stuff.
That's exactly it. So we're talking about typically DIN-REL switches, so they fit in a very compact space. They're fanless. They're typically IP rated. So they're designed to go into harsh environments, manufacturing environments, oil and gas, water treatment plants, that type of thing, specific OT environments. But also, on a side note, you often see ruggedized equipment, say, in restaurants, right, where there might be a high amount of dust or something else that may affect regular Ethernet switches. Ruggedized switches actually can be placed in those environments as well.
Grease, James. It's grease in
Yeah,
restaurants.
I didn't want to say it. I didn't want to say it, but the grease and flour and things like that, they don't do well for standardized switching.
For sure. So getting under the hood a little bit, Fortinet's known, one of the things you're known for is developing your own ASICs for your firewall line. What are we looking at under the hood in the switch portfolio? Are you merchant silicon? Are you building your own?
We're not necessarily developing specific ASICs for our switching line, because in the way that our switches interact with FortiOS, really a lot of the intelligence is sitting there at the FortiOS level. That doesn't mean that the switches themselves are not as capable or have the same type of capabilities that you would see from any other vendor switch. But it does enable us to, when we're looking at our customized ASICs, to really still focus on what's driving FortiOS, which is the FortiGates and the FortiGate hardware.
Although,
Okay, so if I was to open a box, I'd probably see some merchant silicon in my switch.
You would probably see some merchant silicon.
Yeah.
Although to be fair, James, it is true that because of this way that we work together, the switches and the APs with the FortiGate, we have put controls into our custom silicon within the FortiGate to facilitate those connections and ensure that those FortiGates can pick up and manage all these devices without an overall impact to the firewall.
That's a great point, Chris. I mean, when we start to look at what we're really doing here and having FortiOS really be the controller for our switching and for our wireless, we have built specific capabilities within the FortiGate to be able to support that. So when we talk about the custom ASICs and when we talk about just the control for wired and wireless networking, just as Chris says, there's pieces in there that are developed specifically to support what we call FortiLink, which is our control process for the switches and the APs.
So we talked about the Ethernet switches. Let's get into access points. Can you tell us what's in the portfolio? And given the time we're recording in November 2024, Wi-Fi 7 is emerging. Are you supporting Wi-Fi 7?
Yes, actually, Fortinet was an early producer of Wi-Fi 7 into the enterprise market. We had our initial Wi-Fi 7 APs actually released and in market at the beginning of 2024. I know, there's always that game of announcing and then when does the hardware actually show up? But we actually had new units produced and in market in Q1 of 2024. So we really believed and continue to push that standard forward and make that available to our customer base. We have pretty much the full line of access points I think most people usually look for. Your traditional, indoor internal antennas, aesthetically pleasing, put it up on the ceiling. People mistake it for a smoke detector type of AP. We do also offer, external antenna ones for folks who need to do some cabling or otherwise need that range of pattern that comes with being able to leverage external antennas. And of course, we have a portfolio of external antennas that can be matched up with our APs. We also offer, your wall plate style that can actually be mounted directly onto like a junction box. We tend to see those more in hospitality, but I've even seen them in other locations, some types of stores or any place where they have this, they're really going for an aesthetic and they really just don't want the AP to really be visible at all. They want to be able to hide it down on a junction box somewhere under a table and then nobody sees it because they'll just assume that I guess the Wi-Fi is magically appearing. I don't know.
It's just there in the air. Although I think our audience is the type who likes to go into an environment and play spot the AP. So
yeah, and find it right spot the AP.
yeah.
But just like James was talking about, doing more ruggedized switching, we do have a full line of IP67 access points. So fully ruggedized for outdoor environments or freezers or anything like that. And we have also, within the last 12 months, we have introduced a C1D2 certified access point. So we can move into oil and gas environments, places where you need to ensure that that device is not going to create spark.
Okay.
Now, just like your Ethernet switches are your own design, are these APs your own design? I ask that because there's a lot of complexity that goes into an access point, especially with as modern Wi-Fi, all the different radio frequencies and antenna design and so on. There's a lot to it that goes in those APs.
Yeah, of course, just I think similar to switching where we do leverage a contract manufacturer to actually build these things. We have an engineering group internally that is responsible for, working with some of these chipset providers on the radio side to build out what we want this AP to look like. So this is not just going shopping, as it were, off the shelf, somewhere in those places that produce these things and just saying, yeah, give me that one. We are involved in the design of these APs to ensure that they can deliver what we want them to be able to deliver.
Are there particular verticals you're targeting for the Ethernet portfolio? Or I guess, to put it another way, who's buying switches from a firewall vendor?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. In particular, we've been mentioning OT as a vertical that we are focused on, not just within the Ethernet portfolio, but just as a company, we've been very much focused on OT over the last several years. But where we see there's not a particular vertical, but we do see applications, particularly for the distributed enterprise. So the distributed enterprise could be anything from a retail establishment all the way up to, say, for example, insurance or banking, where you're going to have a variety of different sites. The reason why there's such an interest for them is because of the simplicity of management and the integration directly into FortiOS which also powers not only our security, but things like SD-WAN for us. And what that does is it gives our customers a solution that is more or less an end-to-end, particularly within a distributed enterprise. That said, we also get deployed in campus applications, and as you can imagine, every vertical has a campus or a headquarters, and so we see deployments there as well. But there's not a, say, for example, we focus specifically on oil and gas, or we focus specifically on hospitality or something along those lines. We really look at the deployment types, and those deployment types across multiple verticals, across multiple industries.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but you guys mentioned along the way here that the switches and APs are also running FortiOS. So if I'm a Fortinet user and I'm used to FortiOS, it's going to be the same thing that I'm used to on these switches and APs. Okay, how do I translate that into my network operations? What does this feel like? Is there like separate management tooling that I'm using for the switching and the AP infrastructure versus firewalls?
So that's a great question. One of the things that James was just alluding to that a lot of our customers have really valued is that the management of the switch and the APs is done directly in the FortiGate firewall. And for those anybody listening, if you're familiar with a FortiGate interface, if you've used one in the past, you know that that menu that extends down on the left-hand side has all the different categories of things on your firewall. Keep scrolling on down, you'll notice that there is wireless and switch management tucked in there as one of the options.
Hmm.
So you have this benefit of if you, and this is where we have really found so much growth, is for anybody out there who is familiar with FortiGate, you're actually familiar with a Fortinet switch and wireless controller because it's right there built in, same level of controls. In fact, when you are configuring security for those switch ports or for your wireless SSIDs, those things will show up in the FortiGate interfaces screen. So it's not even like you're going down a completely separate rat hole to go do this. You've already been using the interfaces screen on your FortiGate to assign all your security policies right on for those front ports on the front of your gate. Now you keep scrolling down. Hey, there's your FortiSwitch ports. Assign your security policies the same way you were before. Keep scrolling down. Hey, those are your SSIDs. So you're already leveraging, for anybody who's touched a FortiGate, and we ship a lot of FortiGates, that's going to be a lot of your listeners, it's leveraging the same UI people are already familiar with and the same tools for config, particularly around the security settings that they're already doing.
So there's a different way to think about this, though, from an engineering perspective. I'm used to built a lot of networks, and the security domain and the switching domain tended to be separate things. They met in the middle somewhere, but they were separate environments you managed, and there was different thinking processes that go. It feels like with this way of thinking about it, you're building a unified infrastructure and deploying a unified security policy across these devices, and that sharp divide between this is a firewall that's managed like this, these are switches that are managed like this, that begins to go away.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. I mean, now that said, we do have some of our larger enterprises where they still are somewhat siloed, and you have the ability to be able to designate, just as you would imagine, these functionalities are being able to be managed by this team, these functionalities are being able to be managed by that team. One thing I will add in there, Chris was mentioning being able to manage directly out of the within FortiOS directly on the FortiGate. You can actually begin to manage at scale when you start to look at things like our FortiManager. And FortiManager is a manager of FortiOS, and it's utilizing and connecting to FortiOS. So when you push out the configurations or do configuration changes or troubleshooting, you actually have the ability to look at multiple FortiGates. So in the example where I gave, where it's a distributed enterprise where there may be hundreds or thousands of sites that you need to deploy, orchestrate, manage, optimize all of those day 0 or day 1 to day 3 operations, you're more than likely doing that through FortiManager because you're not going to want to directly log into each individual FortiGate. It would be just too onerous. But you have the ability there to be able to have just that single config in the FortiGate that has all those items that you discussed, Ethan, where you're looking at the switching, the wireless, the obviously the security, even NAC functionality is built in there because as a layer 7 firewall, we see everything coming through and can profile and onboard things.
Well, this does bring us to the end of our time, but if we've piqued listeners' interest in finding out more about the switches and the APs that are in the Fortinet portfolio, where should they go?
They can go to Fortinet.com/LAN Edge. That's all together, just LAN Edge. And they will be able to find more details specific around our Ethernet switching and Wi-Fi access points.
All right, that's Fortinet.com/LAN Edge. We'll have that link and others in the show notes that accompany this podcast. Thank you, Chris and James, for joining us. And thanks to sponsors. Sponsors make everything that we do here at Packet Pushers possible. The other people who make it possible are you, the listener. Thank you for being here with us. If you like this episode, you can find this and many more fine free technical podcasts along with our community blog. It's all at packetpushers.net. You can follow Ethan and I on Blue Sky. You can hear us on Spotify. And if you would, leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts. And last but not least, remember that too much networking would never be enough.